Welcome to everybody. I'm Chris Adams, the Executive Director of the Center for Vocational Ministry at Azusa Pacific University, which exists to cultivate resilience in ministry students and leaders through research, resources, and relationships. And we've been having a series of what we call our living room series, because we're all typically working from home nowadays and joining things like this via Zoom. Series of topics that are relevant to what's going on in the world right now and going on in our country. And a lot of the pastors that we're connected to in the center are pastors in urban contexts in greater LA or other major cities. With COVID, with other political tensions and racial tensions and protests, some of them peaceful, some not so peaceful, going on across the country. It's just up the ante for stress in urban ministry. And so we asked one of my favorite colleagues and friends at APU, Dr. Jennifer Payne, to share with us from her research. Dr. Payne is a professor in the Department of Social Work here at APU. She's also ordained, an ordained evangelist with the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World. She's the CEO of a nonprofit organization called Direct to God, with the mission of linking needy individuals to faith-based social service programs in their communities. And so she's been both in a clinical role as a social worker as well as a pastoral role, and she shares our heart for the well-being of clergy who are serving in very challenging circumstances. And she's done some really top-notch research about that, as well as lived that herself. And so it's really a pleasure to have you, Dr. Payne. Thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you, Chris, for inviting me. Yeah, so this is one of those topics that's near and dear to my heart, and so I want to share some slides with you. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay. All right. So yeah. So this is like I said, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Discussing trauma in the urban ministry, and actually, when you think about it, there's not been too many discussions about this that I've heard about in my own circle. So let me tell you a little bit more about the personal significance of this for me. So I am a LCSW, so that means like I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been an LCSW for more years than I like to say. You probably will date me as being one of the baby boomers in old age and all of that. But at any rate, like I've been a LCSW so licensed for over 20 years. In addition, I am, just as Chris said, I'm an ordained minister. I've been in the ministry since like early 90s, but I got ordained in 2002. And so in my capacity of being a help person or support for my pastor, because I'm not the pastor of the church, but I'm the assistant pastor. And in my support of my pastor over the years, what has happened is my pastor began to rely on me quite a bit in order to, look at the things that are going on in the church in regards to mental wellness. So there are a number of different, issues that might pop up in church. And when it was in the mental realm, he would push it over to me. And so over the span of time, over years, I saw a lot of things. And so I began to wonder, like, I wonder how other pastors, I wonder how other churches are handling these same things. I'm just curious about how other churches are dealing with these like mental health issues. And so because of that curiosity, that's how I got into this research thrust. So let me just operationalize trauma for you very briefly. And so, there's a number of different definitions of trauma, and the term trauma, of course, is very widely used. There's lots of meanings depending on the way that it's used. And really, there's kind of a spectrum of trauma where you have, microaggressions, and other types of stressors that are very different from complex psychological trauma. So, I think diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD falls somewhere on that continuum. But as far as trauma in this presentation, I got the definition from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And it describes trauma as either experiencing a serious injury to self or someone else, facing imminent threats of serious injury of self or others, or experiencing a violation of personal physical integrity, which might mean, like for instance, sexual abuse or even emotional abuse. But in this study, that term is used loosely because really it's the pastors that are defining what that term means, not me. So just briefly, I want to kind of give like a little bit of context. And I think as I'm talking about this context and about this study, we have to remember that this is pre-COVID. All of this is pre-COVID. And so there's been like, like thousands of changes that have happened or taken place since, this has happened. But maybe, hopefully, this data could give us, some help in terms of direction on how to, help our pastors in regards to the counseling issue, even though it's pre-COVID. So, like, when you look at urban areas and you look at, violence, there's lots of research out there that shows that, the trauma exposures in urban areas are much more prominent than in, say, suburban or rural areas. So there was one study that was done, and it said that 42% of individuals who were screened in an outpatient clinic had a positive screen for traumatic stress, and that was in an urban area. There was another study done, it's called the Detroit Neighborhood Health Study, and it looked at exposure to violence in an urban community, and the researchers found that there was a lifetime prevalence for the people who were a part of that study. A lifetime prevalence to at least one traumatic event was as high as 87%. So 87% of those individuals had at least one traumatic event in their life. And as far as assaults, 51% of them had been assaulted at some point in their life. So, like the urban areas, they're of course, because they're more denser and other issues impact urban areas, there's a lot more exposure to violence. But there are positive interventions that can help with trauma. So there's a lot of evidence-based interventions out there that are able to actually deal with trauma. I'm not going to go into detail about the different ones, but people are able to get symptom alleviation if they're willing to get the treatment. But the problem is that treatment only works for those who are, number one, willing to get it, and there's a lot of stigma that happens in the urban communities and in low-income communities in regards to mental health treatment. And then for those who do finally decide that they want to get it, the access issue is a problem in urban areas. So there's still issue in regards to having available trauma treatment for people in urban areas. So because of that, there's a lot of research that shows that mental health is underutilized, especially in low-income populations, in resource-poor groups, in certain racial and ethnic groups, those that are in urban areas. Like I already mentioned, stigma. A lot of times people do not want to walk into a mental health center because of stigma. For example, I used to work at a mental health center in South Los Angeles, and it's a big gray building, looks almost like a prison, has the big words mental health center in big blocks on it. Nobody wanted to go into that building. I mean, only reason why I went in is, because I worked there, but the point is that there's a lot of stigma that's in the like ethnic communities, in the urban communities, and in the church about mental health. Also, what ends up happening is there's a lot of people that would instead go to informal supports. So they rely on their clergy more for counseling, in underrepresented groups than they would rely on a mental health personnel. And in fact, there's some really large like epidemiological studies that show that individuals contact clergy more often for counseling than psychiatrists or general medical doctors. And again, this reliance on clergy is more prominent in minority communities, in low-income communities, resource-poor communities. Okay, so I'm going to kind of like breeze through this, but the reason why I did this study is because really I had been reading this literature for a while, and I saw very few studies that actually asked pastors how they felt about these issues in their own words. Like, what is their lived experience of counseling? And so this study is unique because it doesn't like predetermine like definitions about mental health or psychological well-being based on theological assumptions or psychological assumptions. Instead, the whole goal is to listen to the pastors themselves, allow them to explain their own lived experience of what counseling is for them, how they define it, and how they counsel based upon their own paradigms. And so the methods for the study were that I interviewed, and it was like either in-person interviews or it was audio through by phone. It would have been interesting if this had happened in COVID, because then I probably would have had more like video-based interviews, but that was an option, but none of the pastors took that option at that time. But so 48 Black, white, and Hispanic Protestant pastors were interviewed, and they came from two places. They came from urban areas of LA County or in urban areas of Cook County, Chicago. And so each of the pastors, what they did is they were interviewed for approximately 90 minutes. It was a qualitative, semi-structured qualitative interview. And so in terms of the research methodology, it was a phenomenological methodology. So again, the main goal was to look for the lived experiences of these pastors as they address these behavioral health issues in their own churches or those emotional issues. So these are the main questions that I had for the study. And by the way, this study was funded by John Templeton Foundation. So one question was like, what phenomena have urban pastors experienced when counseling individuals with emotional issues? And then number two is, what service do urban pastors provide to individuals with emotional issues in their congregations and in their communities? So I have like a lot of demographics, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of, breeze through it a little bit faster than I would at another time. But you can always ask me any questions about it. I have the details, so you can ask me questions later if you have, want more information. But anyway, like I said, that there were 48 pastors, and this is a breakdown of how the pastors were distributed. 10 Black pastors and 9 white pastors and 4 Hispanic pastors in LA County, 11 Black pastors, 10 white pastors, and 4 Hispanic pastors in Cook County. Now, initially, like this was like about $100,000 Templeton grant. So we initially only were proposing to look at Black and white pastors, but then we got a supplement to do a few interviews with Hispanic pastors. So that's why Hispanic pastors, there's less number than the others. And so in terms of the clergy characteristics, so you can kind of see that for yourself. Obviously, most of them were male. It's obviously because it's right there, but in terms of the primary employment, the church was the primary source of income for the majority, so 62%. And so, I'm thinking about that even now as COVID has taken place, and I'm wondering how these pastors are doing, anyway, the age, the mean age was about 50 years old. Mean years of being in the ministry was 24 years, and mean years as a pastor, 15 years. And in terms of congregational characteristics, so what I did was there was studies that were done by Keith Meador and Harold Koenig at Duke University, and what they used is they used the term religious affiliation. So rather than discussing religious denomination, we asked questions about whether they fell in these religious affiliation categories. And so these are the categories that they fell in: 23% mainline Protestants, 15% conservative, 35% Pentecostals, and 23% non-denominational. And then there's other religions, Pentecostal religions. I do have the breakdown of like the actual denominations as well, but again, I won't go into that right now. Primary race of the church parishioners. So I asked about, maybe it might be that it was a white pastor, but maybe their congregation was a multiracial congregation. So I asked those questions. 44% had mixed congregations, 37% had primarily Black congregations in the urban area, 13% primarily Hispanic, and 6% primarily white. And remember that, again, we had a smaller number of Hispanic pastors to participate. So the mean church size was about 278, and the reason why is because, like, I think there was one or two very large congregations, and there were some that were very small. So but in general, they were mostly mid-sized churches. Okay, and so I'm just again breezing through this. You could, I can come back to this later, but this is just kind of some of the information in regards to the secular degrees that they had. So we asked questions to separate out secular degrees from theological degrees. So this is how the secular degrees kind of broke out, and then this is how the theological degrees broke out. Okay, so let me kind of set the context for, like as we begin to talk about the results of the study. Um, so, really the focus of like this study was to kind of take a look at themes that came out of the data that was focused on the issue of trauma. Yes, I have more data than just about trauma, but that's what mainly this was about. But let me set the stage first and kind of talk about a little bit about how the pastors describe their own environments. So all of the pastors, they discuss both their strengths and their struggles in being a pastor in an urban area. So really, all of the pastors they had a lot of optimism and a lot of hope, but they also talked about some of the struggles that they had. So in terms of some of the strengths and the resiliency factors, different pastors, they discussed the joy that they had and they felt in doing God's work in the community. Some of the words that they use is, it is exciting, it's rewarding, it brings me joy. So for instance, Pastor A said, quote, "I'm very elated to pastor in this day and time." Some pastors mentioned that they felt like they were in a good place in the community to make a difference in the community. Pastor B said, the joy is when you see someone with a rough background and their family life is not what they wanted it to be, and they come into the church and you see their outlook on life has changed. Their health and well-being of their mind even changes, and they grow. And then that same pastor said later, he said, "I've never had a hard day. It's challenging, but I've never had a hard day." And so in terms of struggles, a lot of times pastors mention things like the heartache of knowing the potential of someone, but that person not meeting their potential. So for instance, Pastor C said, you know their potential, you know what they could do, but for some reason it doesn't kick in and they stay in mediocrity and they don't move forward. And so many of the pastors, they discussed their church neighborhood environments and how that impacted their ability to affect change in a person's life. And so they felt it was much more difficult to affect change and to fulfill purpose in those types of environments. Not impossible, because they knew God was able, but that it was more difficult. Okay, so there's three things that came up in regards to trauma. The first theme that came up had to do with them discussing the types of environmental issues that they faced and how those environmental issues set the stage for higher levels of trauma exposure. And so they mentioned urban issues impacting their actions as pastors, included like having drugs, like a few said they had drugs being sold right by their church, nearby on the streets of the church. There was some that talked about the learned helplessness of their neighborhood residents, the extremely high unemployment rates that were happening even then. That was, again, pre-COVID. Limited finances for the parishioners to actually support church activities. Higher numbers of individuals coming to the church who were in financial need. Higher levels of substance using individuals in the church environment, and other issues. So you can see that these are some of the types of issues that they brought up in regards to what was going on in their environments. In terms of emotional issues, pastors talked about some of the problems they they saw in their communities that leaked into the church. So again, they mentioned substance abuse. They mentioned that, there were some individuals that had been incarcerated, not knowing how to, navigate them back into the community or to help them. Joblessness, again, was mentioned, and the violence in the community was discussed. And then as far as emotional issues that come up in the church, they did mention that they had to deal quite a bit with grief and loss, bereavement issues, traumatic violence, as well as through natural causes, substance abuse, and so that was an ongoing thing. Teenagers going through rough environments like bullying, self-esteem issues, older adult issues that were exacerbated by finances and chronic health conditions. And then, they mentioned being faced with depressed people or individuals at times, persons with PTSD, and even bipolar disorder and schizophrenia at times. For instance, Pastor Q said, well, I have more than one person that's dealing with bipolar and being schizophrenic. So the second theme that came up was that many pastors, and this was something that came up naturally, but I mean, like it was kind of fluid that came up, and I was surprised that it came up. But they mentioned their own prior experiences with trauma, and I didn't solicit them to give that information, but they gave that willingly. And so there was some disclosure by many of the pastors that they had personal experiences of trauma that they navigated. And so, like, all of the pastors were asked a question if they had any personal experiences with depression, suicide, or trauma, but also you have the option of skipping this question entirely. You don't have to answer it. So in terms of their own experience trauma, Pastor B, for instance, he discussed that his daughter was sexually abused in a daycare incident. He talked about the struggles that as a pastor that he dealt with, the challenges his own family went through of, trying to deal with that situation. And it was hard for him to preach about why do bad things happen to good people at that time. Pastor G, he didn't go into detail, but he did say that he was sexually abused as a child. And in those days where he was raised, nobody talked about those issues, especially not male sexual abuse. So he said, he, quote, swept it under the blood of Jesus. And he says it doesn't bother him at this point in life because he received healing from Jesus. Pastor H, he talked about his personal experiences with the issue of suicide. He said, I've had members that have committed suicide. I've had distant cousins who have committed suicide. And just that trauma has given me a point of reference, that depression slide could be so slippery. And then another pastor, he said, I have relatives that are incarcerated right now. When I'm counseling parishioners or community members that are on probation, I'm very sensitive to the fact that the same situation, the circumstances that allow for my particular loved one to be incarcerated, these people may have been victimized and may even be the perpetrators themselves. I have those issues in my family too, so I cannot act as if those issues aren't there with one of God's own. I have to be sensitive. The same dog that bit me bit them. I just came to Jesus and had my rabies shots first. And then the third and last theme had to do with trauma, re-victimization of the pastors themselves, even at the time that I was doing the interviews. So what pastors were saying is they were experiencing vicarious victimization through their present day experiences. And some past traumas were being re-triggered in them. So for instance, a few pastors were saying that the community struggles were so overwhelming that they could traumatize or paralyze the pastors themselves. There was a female pastor from a very impoverished area of Chicago. She started crying as she was talking to me. She was talking about the need to have to bury and do funerals for young people who had died of gun violence almost on a weekly basis in her church. And she says, this is every day. My young children, my teachers are coming, my teenagers are coming, and this almost brings tears to my eyes. She started crying, especially in the warmer months, telling me who died, how he died, when he took their last breath, what the sounds they made. This is seeing your family, seeing your friends die in the streets. At that point, I had begun to it was just overwhelming. So, you think you're prepared, but you're not really prepared, not for those types of when you don't know if a person's going to make it. So I know like my time is kind of wrapping up in terms of the presentation piece. So maybe that we can move into like a discussion soon, but I just wanted to kind of summarize based upon, what this data had, is that there were certain recommendations, or there were certain things that they said, these urban pastors said that they needed that can help them. So these are some of them: mentoring by senior pastors who have dealt with these same issues, obtaining standardized or vignette-based training on certain issues, training on healing one's own emotional traumas and scars, the ability to shadow clinicians, either in hospitals or mental health centers, actual reference guides, resource books, practical written resources, and then a systematic way of knowing available community resources that are faith-friendly, affordable, and effective. So these were the things that they really focused on. I do have to mention just briefly that all of these pastors were extremely clear about their scope and practice. So they knew that their role in counseling was primarily to show care and listening, to pray, to discuss the Bible's relation to the parishioner's issue, and to refer as needed. They were not acting in any way, as a mental health an expert, unless they had that background. And they said that over and over, they said that over and over. So I think I'm going to stop there, but just to say, remember that this is in the context of pre-COVID. So things have gotten worse for the urban community. Higher exposures to COVID-19, of course, are associated with increased depressive and anxiety symptoms. That means there's more anxiety out there in the world, more anxiety that's, getting to the church. All churches, of course, are impacted by COVID, but these urban pastors were feeling isolated. They were already financially impacted. And so I'm sure that they're much more impacted now. I could even, I feel even for my own pastor, how he had to shut down, his church, and he has a small church, so there's not much money coming in. And then you add on, what Chris alluded to, earlier, that there's a national crisis as well regarding police brutality, death by cop, or death by vigilante. There's a lot of anxiety in urban communities, low-income communities, because we don't want our daughters, our sons to die, and so you just added extra. There's extra that's added to these urban pastors. So at that point, I think that's where I want to stop, and feel free to let's try to see if we can have a conversation about where might we go from here based upon this.
Dr. Payne, thank you so much for your presentation. Very enlightening, and a lot of information that I was personally just unaware of. So appreciate that. There's some questions that came in to me that I would love to share with you. And I think it'd be a great starting point for our discussion. This one probably, I would resonate with this personally. How would you coach someone who is asked with caring for urban clergy, but doesn't live in the urban context, or doesn't have any background to the urban context?
Well, I would think that I think like the good thing about coaching is that coaching is based upon whatever it is that that other person needs. It's not really based upon like me and my background or what I have or don't have. So really, what you're asking, I believe, like in coaching, is so what are your needs? What are your goals? What's your vision? So I think that in and of itself would be so helpful to these urban pastors that are isolated and that don't have somebody to talk to about this. So yeah, I personally don't think that that's an issue. I don't think that you have to have that background in order to be helpful. And then of course anybody else can chime in as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we're a small group that if anybody does have a question or comment, maybe if you could just stop sharing your screen so that I can.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. So I can visually see if someone raises their hands yeah, there we go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question that I had actually while you were sharing is, what are some things or like outlets that as you interviewed these pastors, how do they protect themselves? How do they protect their own mental well-being through this? Like, what are some things that they can do that you encourage them to prevent them from going into this dark side, basically mentally?
Yeah. So, I'm glad you mentioned that because actually, unfortunately, they did not have too many things in place. They mentioned, and actually, this was it seemed to me, and I felt like my heart hurts because it seemed to me that I was like pretty much like the first person to actually ask them, "How do you feel?"
Oh my gosh.
So they were more than welcome and happy to talk. Like for some of them talk longer than 90 minutes. They really were eager to be a part of this and they wanted to have their say. And so many of them didn't, have things in place. Thinking even on my own pastor, he does not have things in place. People have talked to him, it's like you need rest, you need like specific types of self-care. You need to take breaks, you need to all of the same things that we would talk to each other about, to try to encourage one another during this hard time of COVID-19. I think that they need that. Being pastor is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's it's much worse in the sense than being a therapist that you turn it off and turn it on. Like you're, 8 hours and then you go home. There's not, so it's very hard for them. So yeah, I think definitely the same things that I would even be doing that I do myself, like the things I use apps like Calm. I help to make sure that I get good sleep. Just those things to try to regulate your self-care. I think that just even starting with that would be helpful.
Mm. Do you find in relation to that, when you recommend stuff like that, do you find a posture of receiving that, or it's almost like I already know and there's so much to do and there's this, I need to do this or else nobody else is?
I think it might be on a continuum probably. And, like different pastors, they react to it differently. And again, I'm just mentioning my own pastor, I think he's finally getting in a place where he knows okay, I really need to do this. But there's so much that's put on pastors that are individual pastors and they're on mid-sized churches or smaller churches, there's so much placed on them in terms of keeping things running, that sometimes they feel like, there's not, maybe I can't do that, or maybe, maybe God is not, maybe that's like I'm a weak person if I do that. So, and then sometimes our parishioners put them on a pedestal and expect them to be Superman or Superwoman. So, yeah. So I think it's like like when the best times that I've had, like I've had trainings where I've done trainings on like a whole like diocese or a whole like group of people, and so that those are the ones that work best when you have not just the pastor there, but you have the pastor's wife, you have the congregants, because that way you kind of like get them all into a community of, okay, this is the way that you deal with, like to create a trauma informed church,
Yeah. Dr. Payne, my first church that I served at was in Providence, Rhode Island, and it was a elderly community, and they were primarily Armenian. And I felt like I just came out of seminary. I was just not ready to deal with, to be honest, some of the homelessness that was going on right around outside of the church. And here's an Armenian ethnic community not really understanding how to love the people that are literally on their steps of their church. What would you say, or how would you recommend, like a place like a seminary or our school, what would you say recommendation wise in getting pastors to be better equipped to handle situations like traumas? I remember my pastoral counseling class, it was like, you're not a trained counselor, so you have X amount of time to care and love your people, but then refer them to someone of a mental health department. And I really felt like that wasn't getting me ready to really handle the ministry context that we deal with. So do you foresee any kind of things that we could do differently at a seminary or prepping the next generation? I know that was a long kind of question, but
yeah. No, absolutely. And this is just my opinion. And I am biased because I love social work. I've been in social work for over 20 years. I have a bachelor's in psychology, and I'm also working on a master's in psychology now. But nevertheless, I know social work works on the person in situation. And because of that, I think that the best pastors, they have dual programs where, seminary and social work, like hand in hand. Those are the best, to me, like over time, as I've, run into different pastors and had discussions, those that have social work background, they're much better able to understand like how to deal with community and how to deal with all these issues, both the micro and the macro, the homeless issues, issues of repression, all of that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if we were sitting at a academic cabinet kind of discussion on programs and in the seminary or whatever, we can make that kind of a suggestion on saying, okay, what would it be like if we make it a requirement for pastors to take a course in social work or an elective in that, and what changes would come about in the churches. So that's some great insight. Yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else want to add or ask a question? I'm not trying to hog the time here, so feel free.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Payne.
Sure.
I was reflecting on the slide where you listed just the types of resources that can help pastors in urban settings. It's a two-part question. One is, what What sort of resources do denominations and these environments or networks of churches offer pastors? And the second part of the question is, have you seen specific organizations or nonprofits in whatever part of the country that are trying to bring these sort of resources to pastors in urban settings?
Yeah, so I mean, I work with a couple of them. So like one national program, Pathways to Promise, is excellent in regards to that. So, I mean, if you go to the Pathways to Promise website, you know, that's the whole goal of Pathways to Promise, is to integrate mental health into the church. And in fact, they have like a whole section on even cultural tailoring of, you know, this information for different, you know, based upon different like church denominations, based on different church populations. So yeah, that's a good national resource. I mean, you know, there's a lot of people that are doing mental health first aid. So that's with SAMHSA. So that's another national program. And then like locally, you know, LA County Department of Mental Health has a really like good set of programs that, you know, that happen every month for pastors on mental health and mental, and so they get together every month. You know, they have a faith-based advocacy group. You know, I've done a number of trainings through LA County Department of Mental Health for different churches. And then, but I think that like depending on the denominations, some denominations are stronger at this than others. And personally, I believe it's like it has to do with intersectionality, which what that means is that it's not just about their denomination, but it's about their race and their you know, and how the culture looks at mental health as well. So some people are farther along than others. So my own denomination was kind of far like back, but actually I tried to help them to move forward. Like, and so we started having a number of trainings in our denomination. I'm aware of, let me see, a Seventh-day Adventist group that started really like doing a lot of mental health church, you know, trainings and on trauma, all kinds of things in their church. So I think it just depends on your denomination. Some are really great at it. I think Catholic Charities is good, you know. So some are not. You said you had a two-part question.
Yeah, you answered it. The second part was the kind of on a national level, you know, different organizations that are tackling. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Payne, thank you so much. I was struck by well, all the needs at the end of your presentation, in particular the one about the need for a systematic network of resources. What struck me about that is a lot of pastors, in my experience, haven't thought to develop a relationship with a social worker in their community, and so they can have them on speed dial or whatever, or even on staff. So maybe talk about that a little bit. Like, what's the ideal kind of relationship between a Christian social worker and a pastor? How can a social worker help a pastor?
Oh yeah. So so I talk a lot about like it's called warm handoffs, and so a warm handoff is not just like somebody giving you like here's a list of referrals, go look that up, but it's like what you mentioned, it's a relationship. It's that you've kind of pre-established a relationship already, And then so that like you said, that's that person's go-to person, or in that community, somebody that they already trust, somebody that they maybe know that kind of aligns somewhat with their own faith values. But it takes work ahead of time to establish that. And so I think that it's a two-way street. So the pastor needs to be willing to have that work ahead of time, and to do that work ahead of time. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the pastor himself. It could be, a designee, but somebody in that church, if they want to like create a informal emotional care ministry, then they can begin to start reaching out to people in their communities, close to them, and then making relationships. In the same way, like us as social workers, and that's one thing I love about APU, is because we prepare our social workers to be able to deal with and handle faith, and integrate faith in a client's life. So we want to make sure that they're open, that they're not judging. And you could get a very judgmental social worker. You get somebody who's like, that faith stuff, or you're a faith person, So you want to do the work ahead of time. And it takes work, but sometimes, it just takes like somebody to put a seed in that church, like as far as, you guys should maybe do this work. And I've seen pastors and I've seen churches, little small churches, that actually have like gone on and done that work. So somebody in that church has taken on that responsibility to create resources for their own church.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. We also had Dr. Graffius had a question.
Oh yeah, hi.
Jen, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about how valuable this information is for pastors who are actually going into the urban context. And so much of our training in the seminary setting is very white in its approach. It's like the white evangelical church approach to things. I'm reading with a class the work of Pete Scazzaro, who has worked in a somewhat multicultural environment, but he's a white pastor. And some of the things he recommends for emotional health in leaders is like doing a genogram and those kinds of things. I wondered, in your opinion, if that kind of pre-work for people who have already experienced trauma, who may go into the urban setting again, if something like the genogram or those types of tools that we recommend are actually helpful to pastors, or if that just drums up more of their trauma without, I'm just trying to think, are we giving the best recommendations to our students? Are we using materials that's going to be helpful to them as they go into these urban settings?
Yeah, so I'm trying to get it clear. So you're saying that the recommendation is for the pastor to do a genogram? Okay. I mean, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of like work ahead of time, like for urban communities that needs to be done. It's like stigma work prior to any of that. Like, for somebody to do a genogram, I don't know if that's necessarily going to help them at that point in time to make a decision that they need to get more help for their trauma. Like if you depend on the trauma, you need to have counseling. And so a Christian counselor that's like, able to really like help with that process of healing, that's the best thing. But I don't know how helpful a genogram would just be at that point. So I mean, I've done genograms. I don't know. I don't know if it'd be helpful or not.
I guess maybe that's my question is, and he does recommend having wise counsel with that. and formal therapy. So he's not somebody who would discourage that, but it makes me wonder if people with a more intense trauma background, which it sounds like people who end up in urban ministry often have experienced the trauma of the urban setting before they go into the ministry setting. I just wonder if there's other tools that may be more helpful to them as they're preparing for ministry. You know, other than just saying, like, do the genogram and see what comes up and then see a therapist, you know, like, are there other things we can also recommend to students who may feel called into the urban setting, who have come from the urban setting, that may be helpful for them?
Well, so I mean, if you have students, I mean, it's possible, and then that's why I'm saying maybe like a mix of us, like social work class here or there, but I mean, or even psychology, because there's certain like simple tests that you can do in terms of trauma, like just like, you know, itemized tests and to see those, like I myself just recently did the PHQ-9 for depression and for anxiety, just, you know, along with a group of other clinicians, you know, in order to find out where am I right now, like with COVID-19. So those types of things, like those screening tools, I think those probably are more helpful because it like makes you realize, oh my God, like, you know, I didn't realize I was moderately depressed, or I didn't realize that I had all of these like dings in terms of trauma. So I think those probably would be helpful. But I mean, I can like offline, I can, you know, I can send you some stuff. Yeah. So, but I appreciate your time. It's 11, I know.
And I think we could probably keep going for another hour at least, but want to honor everybody's time. Dr. Payne, thank you so much for carving out time for this. I know this is an extraordinarily busy season for you, and just so helpful, and I think is going to stimulate a lot of conversation about the work we do as a center, as we're in relationship with a lot of pastors who are in urban settings. So we'll be circling back with you about that as we think about ideas and resources we might create together and so forth. And thank you everybody for joining us. Next month, we will have another Living Room Liturgy on the third Monday of the month. And then the third Thursday, I will actually share out of our Flourishing in Ministry research about ministry burnout. As we're 7-8 months into the pandemic, some pastors are sort of hitting a burnout wall. And so we thought it would be a good time to talk about burnout next month. So we look forward to seeing you at that. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. Bye.